My name is Aubrey, and I'm 34 years old. I became a hospice nurse not because I had some grand calling or a perfectly inspiring reason. I became one because I grew up watching my mother suffer, quietly, stubbornly, without ever asking anyone for help. She raised me alone in a small house in rural Ohio, working double shifts at a diner, smelling like coffee and hand soap every single night when she came home. She never complained. Not once, and I think somewhere in me that planted a seed, this need to sit beside people in their hardest moments and just be there. So that's what I do. I hold hands, I adjust pillows, I listen to stories that no one else has time to hear anymore. But before I tell you what happened last winter, the thing that completely unraveled everything I thought I knew about my own life, I need to go back. I need to tell you about my father. I was 2 years old when he left. That's what my mother told me, and for 32 years that was the only version of the story I had. She never said it with anger, which somehow made it worse. She said it the way you'd read a weather report, flat, final. Your father chose drugs over his daughter. That was it. No photographs, no letters, no last name mentioned in passing, just that one sentence that I carried with me like a stone in my chest, all the way through childhood, through high school, through nursing school, through every relationship I ever tried to build. I remember being maybe 7 or 8, asking her once if he ever tried to find us. She was washing dishes. She didn't turn around. She just said, "Some people aren't worth finding, Aubrey," and she changed the subject. I learned not to ask again. What you have to understand is that my mother wasn't a cruel woman. She was a tired woman. There's a difference. She loved me deeply, fiercely. She just loved me in a way that had no room for questions she didn't want to answer. And as a child, you accept the world your parents build for you. You don't know there's another version. You don't know that the story you've been handed might have missing pages, torn edges, whole chapters someone folded away and tucked beneath the floorboards. I grew up believing my father was either dead or living somewhere so deep in his addiction that he had no memory of me at all. Either way, he was gone. Either way, it wasn't my fault. I told myself that every day, even when it felt like a lie. Because here's the thing about being abandoned by a parent. No matter how many times someone tells you it had nothing to do with you, there's a small, stubborn part of you that keeps asking why you weren't enough to make them stay. That question followed me into adulthood. It followed me into my work, honestly. I think it's part of why I chose hospice care specifically. There's something about sitting with dying people, people at the absolute end, with nothing left to perform or protect, that always felt like searching. Like maybe if I listened closely enough to enough stories, I'd finally understand something about people who leave, about people who disappear. I had been working the night shift at Maplewood Hospice for about 6 months when he was admitted. I didn't know it was him. Why would I? I didn't even know his face. I didn't know his voice. I didn't know anything except that he was a 67-year-old man with end-stage liver failure, and his intake form said he had no emergency contact, no family, nobody. That detail, no family, nobody, hit me the same way it always does. Like a small, quiet heartbreak. I've seen it dozens of times, and it never gets easier. His name on the chart was Thomas. I walked into room 7 at 11:14 p.m. with a medication tray. The hallway lights dimmed the way they always are at that hour, and I introduced myself the way I always do. Warm, calm, unhurried. I had no idea my entire life was about to split open. I set the medication tray down on the small table beside his bed and reached over to adjust his IV line. He was thin, the kind of thin that illness carves into a person slowly, hollowing out the cheeks, sharpening the collarbone. His hair was white and his hands shook slightly against the blanket. But his eyes were alert, clear in a way that surprised me. Most patients at this stage drift in and out, caught somewhere between this world and wherever comes next. Thomas was fully present. He was watching me with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable, the way you feel when someone recognizes you and you can't place their face. I smiled the way I always do and started explaining his evening medications. And that's when it happened. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, and caught my badge between his fingers, not grabbing, not startling me, just holding it, the way someone picks up something fragile they're afraid might disappear. He tilted it toward the dim light above his bed and read my last name. I saw his lips move. I saw the color leave his face. And then this man, this 67-year-old man who had said almost nothing since his admission, started crying. Not quietly, not politely. He wept the way people weep when something breaks open inside them that has been sealed shut for decades. I froze. In 6 years of hospice nursing, I had learned to hold space for every kind of emotion. But this was different, and I felt it before I understood it. Something in my chest responded to his crying like a tuning fork struck against metal, a frequency I didn't recognize but somehow already knew. He looked at me through his tears and said, "I looked for you for 32 years. Your mother told me you died in the car accident." The medication tray was still in my hands. I remember that detail specifically because I remember thinking I needed to set it down before I dropped it. I set it down very carefully on the table. I pulled the chair close to his bed, and I sat down. My hands were shaking. "What car accident?" I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were still wet, but steadier. He said my mother's name. He said the town we grew up in. He said the name of the diner she worked at. He knew the street. He knew the color of the house. He knew things that a stranger could not have fabricated lying in a hospice bed at midnight with nothing left to gain from lies. And then he told me his version of the story. He said he had never chosen drugs over me. He said he had struggled, yes, genuinely struggled, and he didn't ask me to excuse that, but that he had gotten clean when I was 4 years old, that he had gone back, that he had knocked on that door with sobriety and desperation in equal measure, ready to beg for whatever small place in my life my mother would allow him, and she had told him I was dead. She had told him she and I had been in a car accident 8 months prior and that I hadn't survived. She told him there was nothing left to come back for. He said he didn't believe her at first. He said he looked, he searched records, asked neighbors, drove past that house more times than he could count over the following years. But my mother had moved us not long after, something I actually remembered, the apartment with the yellow curtains. I was maybe 5, and he lost the trail. He said he hired a private investigator twice. Both times came back empty. He said he never stopped. He said the not knowing had been the defining wound of his entire adult life. I sat in that chair in room 7 for 3 hours that night, long past the end of my rounds, long past any professional boundary I was trained to maintain. I sat there because I was no longer just his nurse. I was the daughter he had been grieving for 32 years, sitting 3 feet away from the father I had been told never wanted me. We were both ghosts to each other, suddenly made real. I want to be honest with you about something because this story deserves honesty. I did not feel a rush of warm reunion, not at first. What I felt was a profound, disorienting grief for the childhood we had both been robbed of, for the photograph that never existed, for every father-daughter moment that my mother's lie had quietly erased before it could ever happen. I felt grief for her, too, in a complicated way I am still untangling, because she was gone by then. She had passed 3 years earlier, and I could not ask her why. I could not look her in the face and ask her what she had been so afraid of that she chose to bury me alive in another person's heart. Thomas passed away 19 days after I walked into room 7. 19 days. That is all we were given. But I was there every shift. I brought him tea he could barely drink. I sat with him through the nights when the pain was bad. He told me about his life, the years of struggle, the years of searching, the small, ordinary details of a man who had lived with a missing piece and built around it the best he could. He had a dog named Biscuit. He had learned woodworking in his 50s. He had kept a photograph, worn soft at the edges, of a 2-year-old girl he had carried in his wallet for 32 years. He showed it to me. It was me. My mother had given it to him once, before everything fell apart, in a different time when they had both still been trying. I held that photograph for a long time. The last coherent thing he said to me was 3 days before he died. He looked at me very clearly and said, "I never stopped." Just that. I never stopped. And I understood exactly what he meant, and I told him I believed him, and I watched something in his face settle, a tension releasing that had probably lived there for 3 decades, and he slept. I don't tell you this story to villainize my mother. I tell it because I think many of us are walking around with only one version of something true. We received a story when we were too young to question it, and we built our identity on top of it without ever checking the foundation. I built 32 years of self-understanding on the belief that my father chose to leave me, that I was not worth staying for, that love for me would always come with an exit. I carried that into every relationship, every friendship, every moment of vulnerability I ever allowed myself. Thomas did not fix that in 19 days, but he cracked it open, and sometimes that is the beginning.